Welcome back. An Education CS Professor George Magoha is today expected to announce the roadmap for reopening of learning institutions in the country as directed by President Kenyatta. While the president reopened some sections of the economy, it has now emerged the government is still grappling with the school calendar. Makori reports that only higher learning institutions may be reopened this year as the government monitors the COVID-19 trend in the country.
President Uhuru Kenyatta's ultimatum to Education CS Professor George Magoha on the reopening of learning institutions in the country is what has kept the COVID-19 Education Emergency Response Committee engaged the whole afternoon. The Dr. Sarah Ruto Committee finalizing on the fate of all learners in the country before Professor Magoha makes public the new education calendar tomorrow.
The Ministry of Education shall jointly, with all the stakeholders in the sector, today, but no later than tomorrow, notify the public on the resumption of the 2020 academic calendar for basic education as well as tertiary institutions.
Citizen TV has established that the big dilemma still remains on whether learners should be back to class anytime soon, particularly the 15 million learners in primary and secondary schools. It is expected that Magoha will announce specific dates for reopening of universities, colleges and technical vocational education and training centers for this year. To reduce numbers, learners in these tertiary institutions will be readmitted based on the academic year and the semesters they are in. E-learning across varsities that have advanced in technology will also be embraced. Sources say it will be impossible for the government to reopen primary or secondary schools this year owing to the large numbers in some schools. However, candidates for both KCPE and KCSE may be considered with strict guidelines before reporting back. Further, it has emerged that today's phased reopening of churches and other sections of the economy is to help the relevant sections of government to gauge on whether and when learners in primary and secondary schools should resume their normal classes. And as the Education Ministry burns the midnight oil to inform the public on the resumption of school calendar tomorrow, achieving social distancing in public schools is still a nightmare based on the huge number of learners. There are questions on how learners in lower classes will be contained and whether it is proper for those aged 6 and below to wear masks. The question of infrastructure also remains a tall order, even as the country awaits the announcement. Makori, Citizen TV.
All right, welcome. And of course, moving from that decision that is to be made by the Cabinet Secretary, to speak to us this morning is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Private School Association, Peter Ndoro. Good morning, sir. And of course, you've seen the decision by the President on what he did yesterday. What are your expectations, even as the Cabinet Secretary prepares to meet stakeholders and make an announcement this morning?
Thank you very much, Sam, for having me. As Kenya Private Schools Association, our expectation is that we are going to find ways and means through which we can be able to reopen learning. In as much as very many of us are looking at how we can reopen our schools, we in the Kenya Private Schools Association, we are looking at how best can we reopen learning. Are we going to bring children in school? Are we going to teach them when they're at home? We are focused on ensuring that learning continues even when we have this pandemic, because we might not be having post-COVID anytime soon. And therefore, the big question that we must be able to answer is what are we going to do for our learners, whether at home or in school?
Right. So, yes, we have to redefine how learning will have to continue, but there are those challenges, and I will ask you a question that I asked the Secretary General of NAT just a while ago. Because the worship areas, the younger worshippers are not allowed, the older worshippers are not allowed. A maximum of 100 are allowed at every religious ceremony. So that would appear to also might affect the learning institutions. And I know you sat in that committee that was advising the Cabinet Secretary on how to resume learning. So what do you think is likely to happen, especially in the new look of a classroom?
Thank you, Sam. There are a number of things that we are going to look at if we are to resume learning anytime soon in terms of reopening of our schools. One of the things that has to be done is the issue of hand washing with soap, sanitizing, masking, issues of social distancing. Yes, the president yesterday did mention that children below the age of 13 years will not be allowed to go back to church anytime soon. Within the Kenya Private Schools Association, we know it is going to be a challenge when we reopen in terms of how are we going to manage the young learners. But as the president indicated, that suspension was until further notice. And that notice will depend on the advisory that will be given by our health experts on how best we are going to manage children when they either go to church or they go to school. So I want to believe when the schools reopen, by that time, our health experts would have guided us appropriately on how we are going to manage the learners under the age of 13 years and basically the entire school. So I believe this is something that we will be able to manage as time goes by, because our doctors are busy working on ways and means through which various places can open and how best all this can be managed.
Mm-hmm. And therefore, this is a question that we have continued to ask you on this show in as far as the impact on the private schools. I remember reading a story recently of a school that had closed down because of the pandemic. How are you surviving, staying afloat, continuing to pay your teachers? Some of the institutions do not own the land that they occupy.
Thank you, Sam. And indeed, private schools as organizations have been the most hit in as far as this pandemic is concerned. Because remember, when the first case was pronounced, immediately thereafter, the government moved in and closed all institutions. Private schools as basic education institutions are not supported by the government in any way whatsoever. They depend on school fees that is paid for by parents when the learners are in session. And therefore, with schools closed, private schools have had to suffer a great deal. Remember, private schools, we have over 9,200 private primary schools across the country. We have over 1,600 private secondary schools spread across the country with about 2.6 million learners. And we have employed about 300,000 members of staff. You can imagine this level of investment without revenue that is coming to us through school fees that is paid when children are in session. These institutions are in distress as we speak because we have no resources at all. One of the things that has been a big challenge to us is the issue of how do we manage our staff? How do we manage the human resource within our institutions? We've also had challenges of institutions that have to pay rent. How are they going to pay rent? At the moment, we are looking at ways through which private schools can be supported, and we have approached quite a number of financial institutions on how the private sector can be supported to get some kind of soft loans to be able to support their activities. We are also engaging the government to find out ways and means through which the private schools can be able to be supported by the government. Right. Because remember, private schools have provided employment to Kenyan citizens, over 300 of them directly and over 600,000 indirectly. So we are trying to work out with the government on how best the private sector can be cushioned, how we can be able to support our teachers who are in distress at this point in time, because very, very many of them are either receiving half salary or some of them are on unpaid leave. So how best can we be able to do that? We have already presented our proposal to the Ministry of Finance. We are also engaging the Ministry of Education and other players to find out the best possible way through which the private schools can also be supported. At the same time, as I told you, we have also decided that in the private sector, we are going to reopen learning. And reopening learning will demand that at this point in time, we engage in online teaching. And therefore, we are trying to develop a system that is going to be used by private schools, and we're also going to open it up to public schools so that learners can continue learning. And as they learn, we are going to ask parents to support the program by giving us a little bit of support so that we can support it even further, be able to engage our teachers, and be able to ensure that learning continues. But as you have not rightfully noted, private schools have been affected very, very badly because unlike other sectors, private schools were completely shut. Others were partial lockdown, but for private schools, they were completely shut.
Okay.
And we have also to come back as the last group.
And speaking of that, so if you are to reopen learning, when do you think is the best time to have the national examinations? I'm talking about the candidates in Form 4 and Standard 8.
Sam, I think I would want to leave that discussion to the stakeholders and the cabinet secretary. That discussion is happening today.
Right.
And the issue of examinations and when is the best time will actually depend on what the stakeholders say. But what I know for sure is that we will subject our learners, both KCP and KCSE candidates, to examinations when they have covered the content that they're supposed to cover at Class 8 and Form 4. But in terms of time and when, that pronouncement will leave it to the Cabinet Secretary to do that once he has engaged the stakeholders this morning.
All right, and we'll wait for that at 9:30 when he will be addressing the media. But in the meantime, in the next few minutes, or maybe it has already begun, a meeting of the Cabinet Secretary with the stakeholders in the education sector. Thank you so much, Peter Ndoro, for speaking to us this morning on the fate of the education sector and specifically with the private institutions. So now we go to another story. In the cargo transport sector, more so long-distance truck drivers continue to pose a serious challenge in the fight against the coronavirus pandemic, with the government on the spot for putting in place COVID-19 testing structures that are not favorable for the truckers, hence creating a loophole. The ripple effect has been a spike in COVID-19 cases in a number of counties that witness a heavy flow of truckers, such as Busia. Nakuru, which is a transit county connecting Kenya to the northern corridor, has now been looped into the high-risk areas, as Marianne Nyambura now reports.
During the daily COVID briefing on 1st July 2020, Health Chief Administrative Secretary Rashid Aman named Nakuru among the top 10 counties recording a high number of COVID cases, with the county recording 8 positive cases by Sunday, bringing the total number to 78. The residents' worst fears are confirmed, though it is among the 16 out of the 47 that has met the 300-bed capacity threshold. As directed by President Uhuru Kenyatta, a new challenge has presented itself after the Naivasha Inland Depot opened for business.
Nakuru lies at a central point and is a major transit point. It is also on the northern corridor, and as you might be aware, that the Inland Container Depot at Maimahiu, which is in Naivasha sub-county, has already started working, and we are having a lot of cargo moving from there to other parts and outside the country. And you can imagine all the people, the truck drivers, the people who do clearing and forwarding, and all the service delivery systems that happen there, all those people are concentrated there. That is a particular risk. And maybe that is why maybe almost a third of all our positive cases are truck drivers.
As the county officials lay bare the challenges they face, given that the county has 5 stopover points, Gilgil, Salga, Maimahiu, Kikope and Naivasha, the residents say that the loophole is a ticking time bomb. Epidemiologists recently conducted an analysis on the disease burden, putting the attack rate at 3.0 over a population of 100,000 people. The county has since collected and tested over 3,408 samples since the onset of the pandemic, with 2 healthcare workers, 24 truckers, 1 inmate and 10 food handlers being among those who tested positive. 3 deaths have since been reported, with the patients having been referred from Kiambu and Narok counties. Marianne Nyambura, Citizen TV.
All right, thank you so much, Marianne, for that. And now joining us this morning is John Wanyama, who is in Eldoret. Of course, Eldoret has been one of the areas affected by the rising COVID-19 cases. It's one of the top counties in the Rift Valley region, but of course also affected by the cessation of movement. You know, so many transporters, transport companies that hail from Eldoret. And John Wanyama, good morning. It's the first day that you're seeing the cessation of movements lifted in 3 months. What has been the reaction in terms of the activity in that town?
A very good morning to you, Sam, and most of the, especially business people in Western Geshu, specifically this Eldoret town. They are saying at least they will now be traveling to Nairobi to go and look for their stock because it was already running out, and they are saying this is the time the president really took the right decision to ensure that he opened up the economy. There are those who are saying they had been locked in Eldoret for 3 months and they have another family the other side in Nairobi, so they are saying it's also another maybe a good time for them to reunite with their family again. But with me here, Sam, is Sheikh Bini from Muslim Faithful, whom we would like to talk to. Sheikh, how are you? Habari ya asubuhi, na pengine uamuzi wa rais kufungua, kama wewe kiongozi wa dini ya Kiislamu, umekuathiri vipi?
Kufungua misikiti ama nyumba za ibada ama kufungua Nairobi?
Yote.
Kwa hakika tulikuwa tumeomba kwa muda mrefu, Mheshimiwa Rais, uchumi umeharibika, watu nyoyo zao zimesusua, yani nyoyo zimekufa, haziendi katika nyumba za ibada, lakini bahati mzuri ameitikia wito wetu. Lazima tumpongeze kwa juhudi zake na kuweka mikakati yake nyumba za ibada zifunguliwe. Isipokuwa kuna mambo mawili matatu, ile jopo ambalo alikuwa amelichagua liangalie upya na lilipige msasa, kwa sababu huwezi kufungua kitu kisha ndani yake kuna uzito. Itakuwa ni ngumu kutekeleza na ni kuwapatia askari nafasi ya kufanya ufisadi. Mfano, wamesema mtu asiingie pendekezo zaidi ya miaka 58 na ili hali wanaokwenda kanisani na nyumba za ibada wengi ni wa umri wa miaka hiyo. Umri wa miaka chini, miaka 20, 25 mpaka 30, damu ni moto, kukimbilia maisha. Sasa unapoziwia watu kama hawa, itakuwa umewaziwia uhuru wao wa kumkaribia Mwenyezi Mungu, na hapo ni wakati mzuri wao kurudi kwa Mwenyezi Mungu kwa yale mengi walioyafanya kabla. Kwa hivyo hili ningelitaka jopo liliangalie. Na kisha pia masharti haya yanapopangwa, haiwi sawa baina ya kanisa na msikiti. Katika msikiti kuna kitu tunatawadha. Kutawadha imesisitizwa na Wizara ya Afya, lazima tuoshe mikono na ndio kutawadha. Lakini katika masharti yaliyopangwa inasema mtu ashike udhu, atawadhe akiwa nyumbani kwao. Ili hali mtu anaishi vijijini, anakuja town kutafuta riziki. Sasa itakuwa ni wakati gani? Kwa hivyo haya mambo ni vizuri wayaangalie ili kufunguliwa kwake kusiwe ni uzito kwa wengine.
Asante sana ndugu yangu. Pengine wewe umeathirika kivipi kwa uamuzi huu na uchukulia vipi?
Asante sana. Naitwa Francis Njoroge na mimi ni mfanya biashara hapa Eldoret Town. Na katika hili jambo ambalo president alifanya jana, mimi nampongeza sana. Kwa sababu biashara ilikuwa imerudi chini sana. Ilikuwa imeharibika sana. Sisi huwa tunaendea stock Nairobi na ilikuwa ni vigumu kuendea. Lakini sasa venye nchi imefunguka tutakuwa tukiendea. Pia hili jambo lingine la kuna hii misaada ambayo imekuwa ikitolewa, kuna yenye nilisikia imetolewa ya kusaidia wanabiashara wadogo, pia natoa himizo kwa president. Make sure hii imefika ili nchi ifunguke vilivyo. Na kuna hii mambo ya makampuni. Kuna makampuni mengi sana yamefunga na mengine yamechuja wafanyakazi. Ninaomba pia president aingilie ili turudi kazi sisi wote na uchumi urudi sawa. Asante.
Asante sana. Thank you, Sam. Excuse me. Thank you, Sam. As you have heard from this, a few people whom we have managed to speak to, they are saying they are happy, though some of them having some questions they are raising, that the president or those people who are looking into their issues should really be out consulting them before they make a decision. But all in all, Sam, everybody, most of people are happy, but whatever we have managed to see around Eldoret town, especially for matatu operators, some, it is sad that most of them have just gone to normal operation. A 14-seater matatu is still going on now, carrying the full capacity of 14 passengers, unlike what the government had already given a directive earlier before. So I don't know why. Maybe they are assuming Corona is over. I don't know what they understand when the president say now they are reopening the economy, but it doesn't mean now that they start breaking the rules and laws of Ministry of Health. Sam.
All right, thank you so much, John Wanyama. That must be too soon. And of course, the warning by the president was very clear. So please do get us some pictures. We'll be using them later on, because up next we'll be having the conversation with the chairperson of the Matatu Owners Association, that is Mr. Kimutai. He'll be speaking to us about some of those concerns that people have in the sector. And as you hear John Wanyama saying that some of the operators in Eldoret have already turned back to the normal operation way before the pandemic hit the country. So we have that conversation after this break.